Hi, welcome back to Blue Room Archive. This is Michael Hicks, and here we deal with books, records, and artwork. And today, as you might guess, I'm going to be talking about Frank Zappa, and I've called this Zappa and Me, 1968 through question mark. If you came to my office at BYU, where I taught as a music composition professor for 35 years, in the last couple years, I was there, you would see on my bookshelves this Frank Zappa license plate. Okay, it's not Frank Zappa's license plate, but you know what I mean. It's a souvenir kind of thing. And when I turned in my key to the office, I took it off of this key ring, which says Zappa Motels 200. And of course, if you know Frank Zappa's work, you know that that refers to the film of Zappa's 200 Motels. The thing that I want to get into today, though, is how my career as a professor of new music composition, avant-garde, experimental, the wild and weird stuff that I spent decades in is either a big footnote to Frank Zappa's career, or if nothing else, Frank Zappa is a big footnote to my career, maybe both. So before I get into, I'll call them 3 little chapters plus an epilogue on this topic, I'll just give, as I often do, a teaser. This pamphlet, and the significance of this will become clear later because it represents the first of my 2 encounters with Frank Zappa in 1984. So, chapter 1. I first encountered Frank Zappa on, of all things, The Monkees TV show. It was March 11, 1968. It was their next to last show. Now, if you know the Monkees, at least by reputation, you think of them maybe as a sort of a slick pop group, the so-called prefab four, pretend Beatles, a lot of humorous stuff they would do, kind of a bad sitcom that they performed some of their songs in, whatever you think of them. They were, if nothing else, about anarchy. And anarchy with a tinge of awkwardness. That was the essence of The Monkees as a TV show. And in that next to last TV show, Frank Zappa appeared playing Mike Nesmith of The Monkees. And Mike Nesmith was dressed up playing Frank Zappa. Now, I'd never heard of Frank Zappa at that time. They were pretty new on the scene. I say they because it was his group, the Mothers of Invention, who had just a week earlier than that broadcast come out with this album. And if you know anything about the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, you know that this is a spoof of the interior of that, and the interior of this is a spoof of the exterior of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's. So anyway, in that little segment on the Monkees show, they do some banter. It's kind of fun. You can go to YouTube and check it out. Frank Zappa, The Monkees, Google it, and you can find it. But one of the things that happens is after a little repartee between fake Mike Nesmith and fake Frank Zappa, is you have Mike Nesmith conducting, like a symphony conductor, Frank Zappa, who is assaulting a vintage car with a sledgehammer, and underneath it is the song Mother People from this album. By the way, the title of this album, We're Only in It for the Money, which is a spoof, of course, on the whole game of the recording industry at that time. So I went and bought this album because I thought, this is kind of a funny, anarchic, weird thing. We loved those weird things. We thought it was playful. Zappa was being strange, and he had that great hippie look that people like us who lived in San Francisco Bay Area in the 1960s, we loved it. We celebrated it. And I got the album, and I thought it was going to be funny, like a spoof of the Beatles. But it was very serious in lots of ways. The opening track, electronic track called Are You Hung Up? In which the phrase, are you hung up? Are you hung up? Keeps being manipulated electronically and so on. And a lot of really serious songs throughout, but with weird, quirky twists. I'll give you an example of one of them. I'll just do an a cappella version of a favorite. It's just a 1-minute song called "What's the Ugliest Part of Your Body?" And it actually sounds like it's going to be this doo-wop thing. So, these doo-wop groups would use this progression. We call it the Blue Moon progression, sometimes called the Heart and Soul progression. You remember that Heart and Soul and the piano? That's it. Well, this song, "What's the Ugliest Part of Your Body?" goes like this. I'll see if I can do the whole thing here. My memory, it's been a long time, but and it's not one that I've ever sung or performed before, but it's perfect in its embodiment of the sort of jokiness of Zappa and the Mother's Invention, but also the serious protest, you might say, element of the group. So it was, what's the ugliest part of your body? Boom, 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 boom. What's the ugliest part of your body? Boom, boom, boom. Some say your nose, some say your toes, but I think it's your mind. I think it's your mind. Whoa, whoa. All your children are poor, unfortunate victims of systems beyond their control. A plague upon your ignorance and the great despair of your ugly lives. Where did Annie go when she went to town? Who are all those freaks that she keeps around? All your children are poor, unfortunate victims of lies you believe. A plague upon your ignorance that keeps the young from the truth they deserve. Dum, 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 ba-dum. It's okay. That's it. That's the whole song. So you have this sort of jokey, it's like you got the punchline there. I love it. It's irresistible. What's the ugliest part of your body? And your mind is going through its Rolodex of body parts. And then he says, I think it's your mind. And then that all your children are poor, unfortunate victims of systems beyond their control, etc. That's really protest music. And it's not protest like we think of Bob Dylan and folk singers of maybe a slightly earlier era. It doesn't have the elegance, it doesn't have the sweetness to it. It's very in your face, assaulting you, or at least assaulting the people of the establishment, we might say. So one of the things though about this album, and by the way, if you don't know this album, you really need to learn We're Only in It for the Money, 1968 by the Mothers of Invention. That's my plug for that, and I get no residuals from that plug, by the way. But one of the things that struck me is that here in the back, it has this, in capital letters, this quotation from Edgar Vargas. It says, "The present-day composer refuses to die." And I thought, who's Edgar Vargas? And why is that there? Well, I went and I got some other Zappa and Mother's Invention LPs. Their first one here, Freak Out. This is the mono version, the stereo version. Fantastic double album set. And guess what? That same quote is inside by Edgar Vargas. The present-day composer refuses to die. So that made me, of course, go look up Edgar Vargas. And I learned later from reading articles and so on, and his own account of his life in the Real Frank Zappa book, 1989, that Edgar Vargas became his inspiration after he got this album. Now, this is not his personal copy, but it's an unusual, hard to find album. I just ran across in a thrift shop one day years ago, The Complete Works of Edgar Vargas, Volume 1. This, by the way, of the many recordings of Vargas's music that you can find, this is one of my favorites. It's so aggressive and so beautifully mic'd and lovingly played. This is astonishing music. And I learned that this was a whole side of inspiration for Zappa, and that he had these other inspirations too, Stravinsky, Anton Webern, and Pierre Boulez, who at the age of 17, Zappa heard Le Marteau sans Maître, that chamber piece by Boulez. More about that in a little bit. Now, I'll just mention, a little sidebar here, Columbia Records had turned down Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, and they went to the Verve label. But Columbia was at this time trying to get its own slate of weird new music composers, not rock singers doing a lot of vocal music, but doing the more unusual avant-garde Varese-like music that you hear hints of and portions of in these records by Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. Well, one of John McClure's discoveries, John McClure was the head of Columbia Masterworks at that time, and I actually had a great conversation with him in 2008 about all of this. But they were promoting Harry Partch, who was even more unusual than Zappa, and who built his own instruments. And by the way, some of which I heard last night being played on Paul Simon's latest recording, the 7 Psalms. They have some of Harry Partch's cloud bowls on them. I can't think of the specific name of them, but they're made from gallon jugs, 5-gallon jugs or something like that. Let me read you this. We'll put this up on the screen. This was the advertisement in this new newspaper, San Francisco, end of 67, started up. And this is in July 1969, the newspaper called Rolling Stone. And they had this advertisement for this album, The World of Harry Partch. Now, it says, this album will probably make a lot of rock musicians feel insecure. It's probably hard for you to imagine anyone more creative and more fluid in its approach to music than today's great rock composer, musician stars. That's why this album will shock you. Harry Partch is a man who's been blowing minds with his music for years. For those that have been lucky enough to hear it, and today, when it seems like everything's been done, his music is not only fresh and different, it's actually revolutionary. Partch doesn't stop at composing and performing his music. He uses his own scale, 43 tones to the octave instead of the usual 8. 8, by the way, bad counting there. His music is richer sounding and more subtle than anything you've ever heard, and even makes his own instruments. Every instrument you'll hear on this album was built by Harry Partch. Field that one, Frank Zappa. So a direct attack, or a confrontation, I should say, with Zappa over this. We're one better than you now. That's the direction things were going. And by the way, you can read about this in an article of mine in American Music a few years ago called Mass Marketing, the American Avant-Garde, 1967 through 71, something like that. It's a good article on all of this advertising and this promotion of new music, which became the core of my personal career. So let's get into that, chapter 2. All right, chapter 2. Let's get into the 1970s. So Zappa's starting to get a reputation. He cuts a great media figure. He's an interesting presence. You can see him on What's My Line, where people are trying to guess him. You know, they have the blindfolds and someone comes on, they're trying to guess who it is. And someone figures out it's Frank Zappa, 1971. It's pretty amazing. That you can find on YouTube as well. He's on the Mike Douglas show, talk shows and so on. So not these screwball things like with the Monkees, but he's becoming this media figure that people know is offbeat, and they don't know how to pigeonhole him exactly, but he's his own thing. Now, at the same time, in 1972, at the American Musicological Society national meeting, Larry Gushee gives a paper on Frank Zappa. This was quite startling at the time because, first of all, they tended not to do American music, but there was a lot of increasing interest in American music at this time as we were approaching the bicentennial of the country. And he did his paper on Frank Zappa. And by the way, he emphasized in his talk, a copy of which I have here, more about how I got that in a minute. he emphasized some things from this album, Reuben and the Jets. Now, it says here, this crazy cartoonish cover, is this the Mothers of Invention recording under a different name in a last-ditch attempt to get their cruddy music on the radio? Well, actually, I bought the album and I hated it because it was just mostly a lot of doo-wop music. It was just imitating the 50s stuff that would have been around in the pop scene in Zappa's youth, not the stuff he really was interested in, this avant-garde experimental music of Vargas, Webern, Boulez, and so on. Gushee points out some of the little tidbits that Zappa slips into the music, even of this, to show you his roots. I'll give you an example of one of them. For example, the opening of Stravinsky's most famous work, I would say, The Rite of Spring. The opening, of course, famous solo bassoon line goes ba-da-da-da-ba-dum, ba-da-ba-ba-ba-dum, ba-ba-da-da-ba-dum. Now, buried in the outro to one of the tracks of this album, one of the voices in this doo-wop thing is boom 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 boom, and you hear this and it fits right in with the chord progression of this doo-wop music, and it's so clear he knows what he's doing there, and he's just sort of saying, I'm into that kind of stuff. I'm just sort of spoofing you with this fake doo-wop music. Anyway, Gushee, it was quite a stir when Larry Gushee presented this paper. As we approached the bicentennial, the new sort of cause for American music lovers was Charles Ives, and Columbia Records was the great proponent of Ives. I mentioned John McClurdy before. He had been championing Parch on the one hand, and now Charles Ives on the other, and they were doing these great collections of Ives's music, box sets, and so on, as we approached 1976. Ives himself doing lots of weird, strange, experimental stuff, even at the turn of the 19th to 20th century. Now, let me just jump ahead a few years to 1977, so right after the bicentennial, just to show you that, just show you how hip some of us were. Because nobody was playing cover versions of Frank Zappa that we were aware of, but a few of us in the Bay Area were. And this particular example, I'll just show you. So this is the Celebration of Spring, 1977, at Foothill College. This is the newspaper announcing it. And you can see here this big upcoming concert. Right here it says Schizoid. And it says the afternoon music will be completed by the group Schizophrenic Continuity. And so they talk about how we came up with that name. And the members of the group are Michael Hicks, me, performing lead vocals, piano, organ, harpsichord, acoustic, and electric guitar. And then some other greats. Fred Burnson, drums and other percussion, sadly died not long after that of leukemia. Rich Coons, fantastic player to this day, keyboard player. Pat Burnham, violin, terrific player, Paul Price. Drew Youngs, fantastic professional musician. These are people who had wonderful careers. There's more of them here on the list. Now, almost all of these musicians are former or present Foothill students representing a small sample of some of the quote-unquote hottest talent the Bay Area has to offer. And now, the band will play for approximately 1.5 hours, performing within a wide range of musical styles. A sampling of the variety of the compositions they will perform includes works by Frank Zappa, number one on this. We didn't do much by Zappa. We did sort of the two sides of Zappa that were emerging. One was the rock protesty kind of side. So we did Trouble Every Day. No time, no way to delay that trouble coming every day. You know, the opening lines, I'm about to get sick from watching my TV. That's the opening lines of that song. But we also did 20 Small Cigars, which was an instrumental piece of his that's sort of in this jazz slash classical, also pop instrumental soundtrack vein that Zappa was mastering, and was able to create this synthesis that was like no one else at the time. Anyway, so we did those two sides of them. Let's jump ahead now to chapter 3, the 1980s. So chapter 3, 1980. I'm finished Foothill College. I spent a little bit of time at Brigham Young University, and now I'm really studying hardcore new music, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And two of my main mentors were Larry Gushee, and so I was able to get from him a copy of his legendary AMS talk, American Musicological Society talk on Zappa, which he didn't give out very freely. And Ben Johnston, who became my dissertation advisor, Ben Johnston, who was the apprentice and assistant of Harry Parch for years. I was writing music, deeply entrenched in these experimental avant-garde traditions that Zappa loved so much. And I was particularly into Stockhausen. The Beatles, by the way, loved Stockhausen, influenced by him in the ending section of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and Barrio as well. And I was writing papers and performing my music and giving talks and the whole bit. I was still so steeped in it. I just got some items here, like I spoke at the Wagner Centennial. That was a big deal in Chicago. The Central Midwest Theory Society giving a talk on musical quotation. I was doing some Mormon things, Mormon History Association, 82, Sunstone Theological Symposium. The American Society of University Composers Region 5 Conference. I'm using this one, this is 1981, because it's a bridge into what I used as the teaser here. This pamphlet, because this is the pamphlet for the American Society of University Composers 19th Annual Festival Conference, Ohio State, April 1984. And the keynote speaker for this event was Frank Zappa. And I was also on the program. Now, to be fair, there were dozens of other people on the program too. But I want to say a few things about the keynote address because I was there. First, let's understand that this was an important transitional period for Zappa because he had come out with in '83 this London Symphony Orchestra, Zappa Volume 1, and it was orchestral music by Frank Zappa. And in early '84, I think, Pierre Boulez, so the hero of the 17-year-old Frank Zappa, did an album called The Perfect Stranger of chamber works conducted by the Ensemble Intercontemporain, I can't say it right, that Boulez conducted in France of Frank Zappa's music. This was a big deal in the classical scene because it was a breakthrough for him into this new sort of legit scene that he had not been really considered strongly in other than little minor excerpts like Gushee's paper and so on. So he was the keynote speaker of this. Well, you can read a version, an edited version of his talk in this book that came out in 1989, the Real Frank Zappa book. There's great memoir stuff in it. And there's a section in this that is his talk from Ohio State, 1984. Bingo, there goes your tenure. That's the name of it in here. But I'm going to say a few things about that event. Three things mainly. Like I say, his music was getting respectable, and they played a lot of his music there. This chamber music of his, Naval Aviation Art and so on, the big title of his at that time, and regular new music concerts that like we experienced all around the country at the time. And here's Frank Zappa being the featured guy. And when it came time for the keynote address, oh, by the way, here's a picture of me waiting for one of those Zappa concerts to begin. It's from me sitting in the audience there, waiting for the concert to start. So we have all these sort of gussied up composers. This is the American Society of University Composers. What an odd name, right? This was generally thought to be esoteric music because it was university professors who were composing it and promoting it and playing it for each other and so on. So it had this dubious acronym of ASUC, and it was, of course, a perfect target for Zappa. So here's the proscenium of leadership of the ASUC. And then Frank Zappa is sitting amongst them. He has dressed down as much as he can, and he had not bathed. You could smell him for, yards and yards away, deliberately to be provocative. So everyone's there in their suits and ties and so on, and he's sitting up there just looking as scruffy as could be, wearing all black, and he gets up to give his address. Now, all the people that he's about to assault are facing us. Okay, we're looking at their faces as they're sometimes turning red, as they're laughing in sort of uncomfortable ways, and so on. So this is how Zappa actually began it, and you can compare it with what's actually the published version. And incidentally, you can find this unexpurgated version of the talk online, as I did. But I remember it well. It was such a vivid assault on this whole enterprise to which we had committed ourselves. And I was about to be a speaker on the program myself, a paper called Silence After Cage, and that did not go well. But it wasn't because of Frank Zappa. So here's how he started. I am occasionally asked to attend forums and symposia on musical matters. I am usually booked in as a novelty act or token eccentric to liven things up for the quote-unquote serious people. This event is no exception. I do not belong to your organization. I know nothing about it. I'm not even interested in it. And yet a request has been made for me to give what purports to be, all caps, the keynote speech. Before I go on, let me warn you that I talk dirty and that I will say things you will neither enjoy or agree with. I am sure you won't feel threatened, since I'm a mere buffoon and you are all quote-unquote serious American composers. For those of you who don't know, I am also a composer. I write old-fashioned music which does not require an explanation. I taught myself how to do it by going to the library and listening to records. I started when I was 14. I have been doing it now for 30 years. I don't like schools. I don't like teachers. I don't like most of the things you believe in. And as if that weren't bad enough, I play the electric guitar. I have made rock and roll albums for the last 20 years, 35 of them. I own all the rights to my master tapes and publish my own music. I earn my living from making music. I am an anachronism in dinosaurs' clothing. I am not one of you, and fortunately for the safety of our planet, you are not one of me. For convenience, without wishing to offend your membership, I will use the word we when discussing matters pertaining to composers. Some of the we references will apply generally, others will not. You can sort them out for yourselves. And so that was how he started. Now, you have to read the talk. Most of the rest of it is the same in the published version in the Frank Zappa book, and also versions you can find online. But he got, as I said, he really got into the, right towards the end of the talk, into the name of the organization. He says, start planning now so everything will be ready in time for the next convention. Of course you can do it. Change the name of your organization from ASUC to We Suck. Steal some cyanide from the chemistry department, put it in the punch bowl at the reception with some of that white wine artistic people really go for, and bite the big one. That was the keynote address. I'm sure there's never been the equal to that in keynote addresses in any organization when it comes to a frontal assault. Well, he was there hanging out to sign or to visit with people if they wanted to after the speech. And I was not the only one. I was just scared to death of him because I represented everything he had just renounced. Not to mention the fact I was in complete awe of him, and he stunk like a barnyard. And so there were a couple of people, younger people, who were not part of the convention, I'm sure that were there talking to him, but he was off at the end of a hallway there, and that was one of the really sad things, looking back, that I just didn't walk up and say, I am living my life in part based on your quoting Edgar Vargas, the present-day composer refuses to die. So, I graduate with a doctorate from University of Illinois later that year. And I go back to live in the Bay Area. And I have the opportunity for the first time to see Frank Zappa in concert, which I did at the San Carlos Circle Star Theater. It was on his 44th birthday, December 21st, 1984. I have said for all the years since then, when people ask me, what's your favorite concert you've ever been to? And I've been to lots of great ones, from Simon and Garfunkel to The Doors to Billy Joel, etc., and tons of classical concerts. Of course, I always say this was the greatest concert I've ever attended. Circle Star Theater, one of its distinctions is it has a rotating stage, so that you're always, very close. You're always in the front row, essentially, or you're very close to the performers at some point in the concert. So for an hour and a half, they played, he and his group, continuously, without stopping, that I recall, brilliantly, and with the same kind of juxtaposition of styles that you have even back in the We're Only in It for the Money days. And the one thing that I loved the most about it was I discovered what an just absolutely astounding lead guitarist Zappa was, which I did not know. And he would play these long guitar solos that were just multimodal and beautiful, the most beautiful architecture of lead guitar solos you've ever heard. And then he might turn around and pick up a stick and start conducting his ensemble in something very intricately composed, you might say, instrumental music. And this was always him, the vocal rock music, and then this instrumental avant-garde stuff, back and forth. Just fantastic concert, and one of the highlights of my life. So 1985 rolls along, and he and I both get haircuts. I got a haircut because I took a faculty position at Brigham Young University, and that was part of the deal. You had to get a haircut. And he got a haircut too, because he started going on all kinds of TV shows and even going to Congress to oppose censorship in LPs and in recordings generally at that time. And so he tried to look really respectable. And so he's wearing all the suits so he looks like the people that he was renouncing and denouncing at Ohio State in 1984. Now he looks like he's one of them, but he's still talking pretty dirty and very abrasively, but brilliantly all the time. Meanwhile, his music, his chamber music, orchestral music, is getting played more and more in its own right. I'm teaching at BYU, and guess what I'm teaching? I'm teaching Vargas, I'm teaching Boulez, I'm teaching Webern, I'm teaching Stravinsky, his heroes, and I'm writing music that is completely in the vein that he was so inspired by as a young man. So so he sort of went his directions, more of a political vein, and was very excited when in 1989 this book came out, and I got to read him talking about his early heroes, and also read that talk again that he gave in Ohio. So, the epilogue. As you probably know, beginning of the 1990s, Frank Zappa contracts prostate cancer. It goes undetected, and he dies in 1993. One of the I'm sorry, I still shudder thinking it's one of the most ridiculous, saddest deaths, young deaths that you can imagine. It was shocking. At the time, he was 54-ish or so, and we lost a lot because he was in his heyday of creative output and thinking, because his mind was always so not only brilliant but generous. So we dealt with it. I continued on my teaching and so on, and became a full professor of music composition and so on and so forth. I acquired things, I got a Frank's finally, after he died, from a collector, this signed Frank Zappa LP. I even got a signed score of Edgar Vargas. Okay, these are hard to find. I did some books, on Henry Cowell, one of the other great American experimental composers, and did a book called 60s Rock, and one on Christian Wolff, who was actually a friend and neighbor of Edgar Varese, but also a wonderful New York School composer in his own right. But I'll just mention to you the favorite part of this epilogue period for me, and that was having a week in 2001, May 2001, Carnegie Hall, hanging out with Pierre Boulez studying Le Marteau sans maître. Part of a workshop group, but I got to hang out with the man, and I knew that Frank had gotten to hang out with them. I don't know how much they talked about Le Marteau sans maître, but that's all we talked about this week. It was rehearsals and a study of it. I got the usual, the signed book. So I got my signed score, for example, of Le Marteau. But more important, I made a lot of notes of the experience. And by the way, if you go to my website, michaelhicks.org, and you go to, I think it's a selected something training, miscellaneous training or something like that, it talks about my workshop with Boulez, and you can click on it and download all my notes from it. But even more important is I have my own marked up score, Le Marteau, with, as you can see from some of these pages on the screen, have comments that Boulez made about the piece. And so it was a special time for me because I loved Boulez's music. I wanted to educate myself better, but also there was this connection with this piece that was, again, an inspiration for young Frank Zappa. Because, as I say, my career, I don't know what it would have been if it hadn't been for him appearing on the Monkees in 1968 and me going, what the heck? And searching out this album, We're Only in It for the Money, and reading that statement of Edgar Varese that sort of took me in these directions that resulted in a beautiful experience for me as a composer. And I hope you'll listen to some of my music from that website, michaelhicks.org. So I guess I will just end by saying, consider this an oddly footnoted thank you card for Frank Zappa. Thanks for listening and bearing with me through these things. I hope you got some good things out of it, and you will enjoy maybe some Boulez notes, maybe some of the illustrations that we put up during the course of this. Thanks so much for watching, listening. I'll see you next time.